Welcome, dear viewers, to another chilling tale from the depths of sinister media. Tonight, we delve into a story that will make you question the very whispers in the wind. Are you ready to uncover the dark secrets lurking in the shadows of an ancient forest? In Echoes of the Forest, we follow Mira Blackwood, a young woman who inherits more than just a family cabin. As she steps into her ancestral home, she awakens an evil older than time itself. An entity of pure malevolence, waiting in the darkness, hungry for revenge against the Blackwood line. Will Mira embrace her destiny as the guardian of the forest? Or will the ancient evil finally break free, consuming not just Pinewood Grove, but the world beyond? Settle in, turn off the lights, and prepare yourselves. The whispers are about to begin.
The shrill ring of Mira's phone cut through the mundane hum of her office. She glanced at the caller ID, Mom. With a sigh, she silenced the ringer and returned to her computer screen, where endless rows of data swam before her eyes. It was the third time her mother had called today, and Mira knew what it was about. She wasn't ready. Not yet. As the day dragged on, guilt gnawed at her. When 5 p.m. finally arrived, Mira gathered her things and stepped out into the busy Chicago street. The cacophony of car horns and chatter assaulted her senses, a stark reminder of how far she'd strayed from the quiet forests of her childhood. In her small apartment, Mira kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of wine. She stared at her phone, thumb hovering over her mother's name. With a deep breath, she pressed call. Mira, her mother's voice was thick with emotion. I've been trying to reach you all day. I know, Mom. I'm sorry. Work was crazy. A pause hung between them, heavy with unspoken words. It's Grandma Rose, her mother finally said. She passed away last night. The words hit Mira like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting them. She sank onto her couch, memories flooding back unbidden. Asterisk, a little girl with pigtails, running through tall grass, laughter echoing across a sun-dappled meadow. The smell of pine and wildflowers. A weathered cabin, its windows gleaming like eyes in the fading light. Asterisk. Mira. Are you there? She blinked, forcing herself back to the present. Yeah, Mom. I'm here. I'm so sorry. The funeral is this weekend, her mother continued. And there's something else. Grandma Rose left you the cabin. Mira's breath caught in her throat. What? But I thought. We all did. But it was her final wish. She left a letter for you, too. As her mother spoke of arrangements and legalities, Mira's mind drifted again, this time to darker memories. Asterisk, a teenage Mira, slouched in an armchair, rolling her eyes as her grandmother lectured about responsibility and legacy. The suffocating feeling of expectations weighing on her shoulders. Heated arguments that ended with slammed doors and tears. Asterisk. Mira. She startled. Sorry, Mom. It's just a lot to process. I know, sweetie. Why don't you come home a few days early? We can go through Grandma's things together. Mira agreed, if only to end the conversation. After hanging up, she sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, the city lights creating a false twilight outside her window. The cabin. Her grandmother's prized possession, the source of so much tension between them. Mira had spent every summer there until she was 16, when the weight of her grandmother's expectations had finally become too much. She'd fled to the city for college and never looked back, their relationship becoming a series of terse phone calls and awkward holiday visits. Now, it was hers. The thought filled her with a mixture of dread and something else. Longing. Nostalgia. Myra's gaze fell on the framed photo on her bookshelf, herself as a child, gap-toothed and grinning, perched on the cabin's porch railing. Her grandmother stood beside her, a rare smile softening her usually stern features. Myra crossed the room and picked up the frame, dust motes dancing in the dim light. "This land is special, Myra," her grandmother's voice echoed from the past. "It's been in our family for generations. One day, it'll be your turn to protect it." "Protect it from what, Grandma?" young Myra had asked, but Rose had just smiled mysteriously and ruffled her hair. A lump formed in Myra's throat as she traced her grandmother's face in the photo. There had been love there, she realized now, beneath the high expectations and strict demeanor. Love, and something else, fear. Worry. Whatever it was, it had driven a wedge between them that Myra had been too young, too stubborn to try and bridge. And now it was too late. Or was it? An idea began to form in Myra's mind, reckless and sudden. She glanced around her sterile apartment, at the piles of work she'd brought home, the empty takeout containers. When was the last time she'd felt truly alive, truly connected to anything? Before she could talk herself out of it, Myra was on her laptop, fingers flying over the keys. Within an hour, she had emailed her boss requesting a leave of absence, citing a family emergency. It wasn't far from the truth, she reasoned. As the city settled into its nighttime rhythm outside, Myra began to pack. She worked methodically, choosing comfortable clothes suited for country life, tossing in hiking boots she hadn't worn in years. Each item felt like a step away from the life she'd built and toward what? She wasn't sure yet. Myra agreed, if only to end the conversation. After hanging up, she sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, the city lights creating a false twilight outside her window. She glanced around her sterile apartment, at the piles of work she'd brought home, the empty takeout containers. When was the last time she'd felt truly alive, truly connected to anything? Before she could talk herself out of it, Myra was on her laptop, fingers flying over the keys. Within an hour, she had emailed her boss requesting a leave of absence, citing a family emergency. It wasn't far from the truth, she reasoned. As the city settled into its nighttime rhythm outside, Myra began to pack. She worked methodically, choosing comfortable clothes suited for country life, tossing in hiking boots she hadn't worn in years. Each item felt like a step away from the life she'd built and toward what? She wasn't sure yet. It was nearly midnight when Myra finally paused, surveying her handiwork. 2 suitcases stood by the door, along with a box of notebooks and her laptop. A summer. She'd give herself the summer to sort through her grandmother's belongings, to fix up the cabin, to what? Find closure. Make peace with the ghosts of her past. She fell into a fitful sleep, her dreams a jumble of childhood memories and foreboding shadows. In them, she stood before the cabin, its windows dark and shuttered. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying words she couldn't quite make out. Her grandmother's voice called to her from inside, urgent and afraid. "Myra, you have to listen. You have to." She jolted awake, heart racing, the dream already fading. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the city skyline. Myra rose, feeling more resolute than she had in years. As she showered and dressed, her mind wandered to the letter her mother had mentioned. What final words had her grandmother left for her? Apologies. Explanations. More expectations. Myra pushed the thoughts aside. She'd face whatever was in that letter when the time came. For now, she had a long drive ahead of her and a lifetime of memories to confront. She took one last look around her apartment, at the life she was leaving behind temporarily, she told herself. The framed photo of her and her grandmother was the last thing she packed, wrapped carefully in a soft sweater. As Myra locked her door and headed for her car, the weight of the unknown pressed down on her. But beneath the anxiety, a flicker of excitement burned. For the first time in years, she felt like she was moving towards something, not just running away. The cabin waited, with all its mysteries and memories. And maybe, just maybe, the key to understanding the grandmother she'd never truly known. Mira pointed her car west, toward the mountains, toward home. The gravel crunched under Mira's tires, as she guided her car down the overgrown driveway. Thick forest pressed in on both sides, branches scraping against the windows like grasping fingers. As she rounded the final bend, the cabin came into view, and Mira's breath caught in her throat. It looked smaller than she remembered. The once proud structure now sagged under the weight of neglect, its weathered boards grayed with age. Weeds choked the front yard, and vines crept up the walls, as if nature was slowly reclaiming what had been carved out of the wilderness. Mira parked and stepped out, the silence enveloping her like a thick blanket. No traffic noise, no hum of electricity, just the whisper of wind through leaves and the occasional bird call. She breathed deeply, the scent of pine and damp earth flooding her senses. Well, she murmured to herself, here goes nothing. The porch steps creaked ominously as she climbed them, testing each board before putting her full weight down. The key stuck in the lock, requiring a few jiggles before the door swung open with a protesting groan. Mira coughed as she entered, dust motes swirling in the shafts of afternoon light that penetrated the grimy windows. Sheets draped the furniture like shrouds, lending an eerie, abandoned air to the place. She moved through the rooms, muscle memory guiding her steps even as her mind reeled at how much and how little had changed. In the kitchen, a faded checkerboard tablecloth still covered the old oak table. Mira ran her fingers over it, remembering countless meals shared there. Her grandmother's hearty stews, warm bread slathered with blackberry jam, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered the room. She shook off the memories and got to work. It took the better part of an hour just to get the windows open, letting in fresh air and the sounds of the forest. As Mira moved from room to room, pulling off dusty sheets and sweeping away cobwebs, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More than once, she whirled around, certain she'd seen movement out of the corner of her eye, only to find empty air. Get a grip, she chided herself. It's just an old house. But was it? As the afternoon wore on, Mira began to notice oddities. A chair that wasn't quite where she'd left it. The sensation of cool air brushing past her in the stagnant hallway. And always, that prickling feeling between her shoulder blades, as if unseen eyes were following her every move. By the time dusk began to fall, Mira had managed to make the living room and kitchen somewhat habitable. She'd found an old generator in the shed, and after some coaxing, got it running to power the refrigerator and a few lamps. Now, she stood in what had been her grandmother's bedroom, hesitating at the door. This room, more than any other, held the essence of Rose. Mira could almost see her there, sitting ramrod straight at the vanity, brushing her steel-gray hair with precise strokes. The air felt heavier here, charged with unspoken words and lingering regrets. With a deep breath, Mira stepped inside. Unlike the rest of the house, this room showed signs of recent use. A book lay on the nightstand, a faded ribbon marking a page. The closet door stood ajar, offering a glimpse of neatly hung clothes. It was the old cedar chest, at the foot of the bed, that drew Mira's attention. She knelt before it, running her hands over the intricate carvings that adorned its surface. Symbols and patterns she didn't recognize twined around each other, forming a border for a central image. A great tree, its roots stretching deep and its branches reaching for the sky. The lid creaked as Mira lifted it, revealing a treasure trove of memories. Photo albums, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbons, and leather-bound journals filled the chest. Mira lifted out the topmost album, settling back against the bed as she opened it. Sepia-toned faces stared back at her ancestors she'd never known, but whose features she recognized in her own. There was her great-grandfather, standing proud before the newly built cabin. And there, a group of women gathered around a bonfire, their expressions serious despite the festive setting. As Mira flipped through the pages, a slip of paper fluttered to the floor. She picked it up, recognizing her grandmother's spidery handwriting. *The wind speaks, but few listen. The forest remembers what we choose to forget. Blood calls to blood, and the duty cannot be denied. Mira must be prepared. A chill ran down Mira's spine. What did it mean? And why had her grandmother written her name? Setting the note aside, Mira reached for one of the journals. The leather was soft with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. She opened it carefully, her grandmother's familiar script filling the pages. June 15, 1962. The dreams are getting worse. I see them in the shadows between the trees, their eyes gleaming with hunger. The barriers are weakening. I fear what may happen if. The rest of the entry was obscured by a dark stain. Mira flipped through more pages, finding similar cryptic entries interspersed with mundane accounts of daily life. References to the duty and the burden appeared frequently, along with mentions of rituals and protective symbols that meant nothing to Mira. Her head spinning, Mira replaced the journal and album in the chest. She'd have time to go through everything more thoroughly later. For now, exhaustion was setting in, the weight of the day's travels and discoveries pressing down on her. After a quick meal of sandwiches she'd packed for the trip, Mira prepared for bed. The pipes groaned and sputtered, but eventually produced a steady stream of water for a much-needed shower. As she toweled off, Mira caught sight of herself in the foggy mirror. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw someone standing behind her, the tall, stern-faced woman with eyes that matched her own. Mira whirled around, heart pounding, but found only empty air. "You're losing it," she muttered, shaking her head. Sleep proved elusive. Mira tossed and turned on the unfamiliar mattress, the sounds of the forest seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet house. The wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves and rattling the shutters. As Mira hovered on the edge of sleep, she heard it, a voice, carried on the wind. At first, it was just a wordless murmur, but then it grew clearer. "Mira. Mira. You must listen." She sat bolt upright, every nerve on high alert. The voice was familiar, her grandmother's voice, she realized with a jolt. But that was impossible. Rose was gone. "Hello." Mira called out, feeling foolish even as she did so. "Is someone there?" Only the wind answered, its mournful keening now devoid of any human sound. Mira lay back down, her heart still racing. It was just the wind, she told herself. Just her exhausted mind playing tricks on her, dredging up memories and mixing them with her surroundings. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, Mira couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest outside seemed to press closer, its secrets hovering just beyond her understanding. And in her dreams, she stood before the great tree from the cedar chest, its branches whispering warnings she couldn't quite grasp. "The duty," the voices seemed to say. "The duty cannot be denied." Mira awoke to sunlight streaming through the dusty windows, momentarily disoriented by her unfamiliar surroundings. As the fog of sleep lifted, the events of the previous day came rushing back. The cabin. The photographs. The whispers. She shook her head, trying to dislodge the lingering unease. It had just been the wind, she told herself. Nothing more. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and a granola bar, Mira set about continuing her cleaning efforts. She tackled the study next, a room she'd avoided as a child due to its perpetual gloom and musty smell. As she wiped down the heavy oak desk, her cloth caught on something. Frowning, Mira ran her fingers along the edge, feeling a slight indentation. She pressed, and with a soft click, a hidden drawer sprang open. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, her name written on it in her grandmother's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, Mira opened it and began to read. My dearest Mira, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and the burden I've carried for so long has passed to you. I know we parted on bitter terms, and for that, I am truly sorry. There is so much I should have told you, so much I wanted to explain. But I was afraid of the weight this knowledge would place on your shoulders, afraid of robbing you of the normal life I never had. But I see now that I was wrong to keep you in the dark. The blood that runs in your veins is old, Mira, older than this land itself. With it comes a duty, a sacred trust passed down through generations of our family. The woods around our cabin hold secrets, dangers that most can't begin to imagine. For centuries, our family has stood as guardians, keeping the darkness at bay. But the old bindings are weakening, and I fear what may soon escape. You must be prepared, Mira. Learn our history. Master the old ways. And above all, listen to the whispers. They will guide you, as they guided me. I wish I could protect you from what's to come, but this is your destiny now. Be strong, my girl. Be brave. And know that I am with you always. All my love. Grandma rose. Mira sat back, her mind reeling. What was all this talk of duty and darkness? Guardians and secrets. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel, not real life. And yet, the whispers. The strange sensations she'd experienced since arriving. The cryptic journal entries. Could it all be connected? As if in answer to her thoughts, the wind outside picked up, whistling through the trees. But this time, Mira was sure she heard something else beneath the natural sounds, a voice, faint but clear. Mira, danger comes, prepare. She leapt to her feet, heart pounding. Grandma, she called out, feeling both foolish and terrified. Is that you? The voice came again, stronger now. The darkness in the woods, child. It stirs. You must be ready. A chill ran down Mira's spine. This was no trick of the wind, or overtired imagination. The voice was real, as impossible as that seemed. Ready for what? Mira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What darkness? But the voice had faded, leaving only the natural sounds of the forest behind. Mira sank back into the chair, her grandmother's letter clutched to her chest. Part of her wanted to pack her bags and flee, to return to the safety and normalcy of her city life. But a deeper part, a part she'd long ignored, felt awakened. The mysteries surrounding her family, this land, she needed answers. With renewed determination, Mira turned to the study's bookshelves. They were crammed with old volumes, their spines faded and cracked. Many were in languages she didn't recognize, filled with strange symbols and diagrams. But others seemed to be family histories and local legends. She pulled out a particularly ancient-looking tome titled Chronicles of the Shadowed Vale. As Mira opened it, a cloud of dust made her sneeze. The pages were brittle, covered in spidery handwriting and intricate illustrations. One image caught her eye, a dark, amorphous shape looming over a forest, with tiny human figures holding up what looked like barriers of light. The caption read, The Binding of the Ancient One, 1692. Mira read on, her disbelief warring with a growing sense of dread. The book spoke of an entity, old as the earth itself, that slumbered beneath the forest. It fed on fear and pain, growing stronger with each passing century. The earliest settlers had nearly been consumed by it, saved only by the intervention of a group of women who used ancient magic to bind the creature. Those women, Mira realized with a start, were her ancestors. The story continued through the years, each generation taking up the mantle of guardianship. They renewed the bindings, fought back the creature's attempts to break free, and kept their vigil in secret. Mira's hands shook as she turned the pages. It was fantastic, unbelievable, and yet, it explained so much. The isolation her grandmother had imposed on their family. The strange rituals she'd sometimes glimpsed as a child. The feeling of otherness that had always set her apart. A sudden gust of wind slammed the study door shut, making Mira jump. Outside, the sky had darkened, angry clouds roiling overhead. The trees swayed violently, their branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. "It comes, asterisk," her grandmother's voice whispered urgently. Asterisk, Mira, you must. The voice cut off abruptly as a deafening crack of thunder shook the cabin. In the silence that followed, Mira could have sworn she heard something else, a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to come from the earth itself. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the book to her chest. Whether she fully believed it or not, she couldn't ignore the warning in her grandmother's letter, or the growing sense of menace that permeated the air. Mira's gaze fell on her laptop, sitting forgotten on a side table. Of course, there might be more information online, local news reports or forums discussing strange occurrences in the area. As the storm raged outside, Mira immersed herself in research. She trawled through local history websites, paranormal forums, and digitized newspaper archives. Most of what she found was clearly fiction, or the ramblings of overzealous conspiracy theorists. But here and there, she caught glimpses of truth: unexplained disappearances in the forest, accounts of strange lights and eerie sounds, and always, the sense of something ancient and malevolent lurking just out of sight. Hours passed, the storm eventually subsiding to a gentle rain. Mira's eyes burned from staring at the screen, her mind overwhelmed with information. She stood, stretching her stiff muscles, and moved to the window. The forest seemed different now, charged with potential energy. The very air felt alive, watching, waiting. As Mira gazed out at the dripping trees, a movement caught her eye. There, just at the edge of the clearing, was that a shadow, darker than the rest, slipping between the trunks. Mira blinked, and it was gone. But the sense of being watched remained, prickling along her skin. "What have I gotten myself into?" she murmured, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. There was no answer, but the gentle patter of rain and the rustling of leaves. But deep in her heart, Mira knew everything had changed. The quiet summer she'd planned, full of healing and reflection, had transformed into something far more dangerous. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, poised between the world she'd always known and one filled with ancient magics and lurking horrors. And like it or not, Mira realized, she would have to choose her path forward. As if in response to her thoughts, a whisper drifted through the room, barely audible but heavy with meaning. "The choice is yours, child. But remember, the darkness does not wait. It comes." Mira squared her shoulders, a mixture of fear and tenacity coursing through her. Whatever was coming, whatever her role in all this might be, she would face it head-on. For her grandmother, for her ancestors, and for herself. The first warning had been given. Now, it was time to prepare. The old truck's engine sputtered and coughed as Mira coaxed it down the winding mountain road. She'd found the keys hanging by the back door, a note from her mother explaining it had been her grandmother's. Now, as she navigated the unfamiliar vehicle towards town, Mira couldn't shake the feeling that she was driving into more than just a supply run. Pinewood Grove came into view, a small cluster of buildings nestled in a valley. It looked like something out of a postcard, all quaint storefronts and American flags fluttering in the breeze. As Mira parked in front of the general store, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, testament to nights filled with unsettling dreams and the constant feeling of being watched. A bell jingled as she entered the store. The scent of sawdust and peppermint filled the air, and Mira was struck by a wave of nostalgia. How many times had she come here as a child, pockets jingling with change for candy? "Well, I'll be," a gravelly voice said. "If it isn't Rose's granddaughter." Mira turned to see an elderly man behind the counter, his rheumy eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. "That's right," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm Mira. And you are?" "Hank Tompkins," he replied, not returning her smile. "Known your family for generations. Didn't think we'd be seeing another Blackwood up here after Rose passed." There was something in his tone, a mixture of wariness, and was that pity. "I'm just here for the summer," Mira explained, grabbing a basket and beginning to fill it with supplies. "Sorting out the cabin, you know." Hank grunted. "Be careful up there, girl. Those woods, they ain't natural. Your grandma knew that better than anyone." Before Mira could press him for details, the bell jangled again. A woman entered, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stopped short when she saw Mira, her eyes widening. "Grace," Hank nodded to the newcomer. "Look who's back in town." "So I see," Grace said, her voice cool. "Rose's girl. Come to take up the family business, have you?" Mira frowned. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I'm just here to—" "Oh, spare us the act," Grace snapped. "We all know what your family does up in those woods. Prancing around at midnight, muttering incantations. As if that's enough to keep the darkness at bay." "Grace," Hank warned, but the woman plowed on. "Mark my words, girl. You're in over your head. Best pack up and leave before you bring trouble down on all our heads." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. "Don't mind her," Hank said after a moment. "Grace never did see eye to eye with your grandmother. But she's not wrong about the trouble." Mira's head was spinning. "What trouble? What did my grandmother do that has everyone so worked up?" Hank sighed, looking suddenly very old. "It's not my place to say. But if you're staying at that cabin, you best be prepared. The forest has a way of testing those who dwell within it." As Mira paid for her supplies, she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her. Through the window, she could see a small group of locals gathered, whispering and casting furtive glances her way. The drive back to the cabin was a blur, Mira's mind racing with questions. What had her grandmother been involved in that the whole town seemed to know about? And what did Grace mean about keeping the darkness at bay? As she pulled up to the cabin, a chill ran down Mira's spine. The front door stood wide open, swaying gently in the breeze. "Hello," she called out, heart pounding as she approached. "Is someone there?" No answer came. Steeling herself, Mira entered the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the air felt different. Heavier somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand on end. In the kitchen, Mira nearly dropped her bags. The chairs around the table had been rearranged, now forming a perfect circle. At the center lay a single black feather. "What the hell?" she muttered, reaching out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the feather, a gust of wind tore through the cabin. Books flew off shelves, papers scattered, and the lights flickered wildly. Mira stumbled back, her heart in her throat. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The cabin fell silent, save for Mira's ragged breathing. She spent the next hour meticulously searching every room, looking for signs of an intruder. But apart from the chairs and the feather, nothing seemed out of place. It was as if the wind had a mind of its own, focused solely on that one, impossible display. As night fell, Mira found herself huddled in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth. She tried to distract herself with a book, but her eyes kept darting to the shadows that danced at the edge of her vision. More than once, she could have sworn she saw shapes moving, just out of focus. A soft thud from upstairs made her jump. Setting down her book, Mira crept up the stairs, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard throughout the house. The sound had come from her grandmother's room. As Mira approached, she saw that the door was ajar, a faint light spilling out into the hallway. She was certain she'd left it closed and dark. Pushing the door open, Mira gasped. The cedar chest stood open, its contents strewn about the room as if caught in a whirlwind. And there, hovering in midair, was one of Rose's old journals. It flipped through its pages frantically, finally coming to rest open on the bed. With trembling hands, Mira picked it up. A passage had been underlined, the ink still wet. The barrier weakens. The watchers stir. Only blood can renew the ancient pact. A low whisper filled the room, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Remember, child. The duty cannot be denied. Mira slammed the journal shut, her breath coming in short gasps. This was madness. Ghosts weren't real. Magic wasn't real. And yet, she thought of the townspeople's reactions, of Hank's warnings and Grace's anger. She thought of her grandmother's letter, of the histories she'd read. And she thought of the shadows that even now seemed to press in around her, watching, waiting. What if it was all true? What if her family really had been guardians of some ancient secret, protectors against a darkness she could barely comprehend? And if so, what did that mean for her? As if in answer, a cold wind gusted through the room, extinguishing the light. In the sudden darkness, Mira could have sworn she saw eyes gleaming from every corner, hungry and ancient. She stood frozen, caught between terror and a strange, growing sense of purpose. Whatever was happening, whatever legacy her grandmother had left behind, Mira knew she couldn't run from it. The past was reaching out to her, uncovering itself piece by mysterious piece. And like it or not, Mira was beginning to realize that her future was inextricably bound to the secrets of this forest, this cabin, and the darkness that lurked just out of sight. With a deep breath, she squared her shoulders. "All right," she said to the empty room, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm listening. Tell me what I need to know." The shadows seemed to pulse in response, and Mira knew that her journey was only just beginning. Exhaustion finally overcame Mira's fear as the night wore on. She fell into a fitful sleep, her dreams vivid and unsettling. As consciousness faded, she felt herself being pulled deeper, beyond mere dreams and into something else. Mira found herself standing in a forest clearing, but it wasn't the woods she knew. The trees here were older, massive trunks stretching up into a canopy that blocked out the sky. Mist swirled around her feet, and in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of chanting. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the heavy air. "Sure," came a response from behind her. "You'll draw their attention." Mira whirled around to find herself face to face with a young woman. She was dressed in simple, homespun clothes of a style Mira had never seen before. But it was the woman's face that caught her attention. It was like looking in a mirror. The same green eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw. This woman could have been her twin. "Who are you?" Mira whispered. The woman's lips quirked in a sad smile. "I am Eliza Blackwood, your ancestor. And I'm here to show you how this all began." Before Mira could respond, the forest around them shifted. Suddenly, they were standing at the edge of a small settlement. Rough-hewn cabins huddled together, smoke rising from chimneys. People moved about their daily tasks, but there was a tension in the air, a wariness in how they glanced at the surrounding forest. "This was our home," Eliza said softly. "We came here seeking a new life, free from persecution. But we found something far worse than what we left behind." The scene changed again. Night had fallen, and Mira could hear screaming. Shadows moved between the trees, faster than anything natural. The settlers ran in panic, some falling to the ground and writhing in apparent agony. "What's happening to them?" Mira asked, horrified. "The darkness," Eliza replied, her voice tight with old pain. "It feeds on fear, on suffering. We didn't know what would awakened when we settled here." Mira watched as a group of women, Eliza among them, gathered in the center of the village. They joined hands, beginning to chant in a language Mira didn't recognize. As their voices rose, a light began to emanate from them, pushing back the shadows. "We discovered we had power," Eliza explained. "Passed down through our bloodline, dormant until needed. With it, we were able to bind the darkness, to keep it at bay. But the cost." She trailed off, her eyes distant. The forest blurred around them once more. Now Mira saw Eliza, older and careworn, standing before a group of young women. She was teaching them, demonstrating intricate gestures, and sharing knowledge from a leather-bound book. "The duty fell to us," Eliza continued. "To guard against the darkness, to maintain the bindings. It became our legacy, passed from mother to daughter through the generations." Mira felt a wave of vertigo, as the scenes began to shift more rapidly. She caught glimpses of women through the ages, all bearing the distinctive Blackwood features, all standing against encroaching shadows. She saw rituals performed under full moons, battles fought against creatures of nightmare, secrets passed down in whispers. "But the darkness is patient," Eliza's voice echoed around her. "It grows stronger, always testing the boundaries." And now, the whirlwind of images stopped abruptly. Mira found herself back in the misty forest clearing, but now other figures had joined them. Women of all ages, dressed in the fashions of their respective eras, but all bearing the unmistakable Blackwood look. "The burden falls to you, Mira," Eliza said, her voice joining with the others in a haunting chorus. "The bindings weaken. The darkness stirs. But I don't know how." Mira cried out. "I don't have any power. I'm not prepared for this." A warm hand clasped her shoulder, and Mira turned to see her grandmother, looking younger and more vibrant than she ever had in life. "The power is in your blood, child," Rose said gently. "It has always been there, waiting. You need only to awaken it." "How?" Mira asked, desperation creeping into her voice. The women began to fade, their voices growing fainter. "Remember," they chorused. "Remember and believe. The forest will show you the way." "Wait," Mira called out. "I have so many questions." But the dream was already dissolving around her. Mira jolted awake, gasping for breath, the echo of her ancestors' voices still ringing in her ears. Sunlight streamed through the windows, belying the otherworldly experience of the night. For a moment, Mira was tempted to dismiss it all as a particularly vivid nightmare. But as she sat up, something fell from her clenched fist. A single leaf, unlike any she'd seen in the surrounding forest. Its edges were lined with silvery script in a language she didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. "The past is prologue. Your chapter begins." Mira's hand trembled as she held the leaf. The weight of generations seemed to press down upon her, the expectations of countless ancestors resting on her shoulders. She thought of Eliza, that first Blackwood who had faced the darkness. Of all the women who had come after, each bearing their portion of the burden. And now, it had come to her. Moving to the window, Mira looked out at the forest. It seemed different now, alive in a way she'd never noticed before. The wind whispered through the leaves, and she could almost make out words, warnings, encouragements, secrets waiting to be uncovered. The gravity of her inheritance settled over her like a mantle. This wasn't just a family legacy, it was a sacred duty. The lives of not just her family, but everyone in the surrounding area depended on maintaining the bindings that held back the darkness. And yet, mixed with the fear and uncertainty was a growing sense of purpose. The power Eliza had spoken of, the ability to stand against the encroaching evils. Mira could feel it now, a warmth in her blood, a tingling at her fingertips. She thought of the town, of Hank's warnings and Grace's anger. How long had they lived under the shadow of this threat, relying on a protection they didn't fully understand? "I'm not ready," Mira whispered to the forest. "I don't know if I can do this." A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying a chorus of familiar voices. "You are not alone, child. We stand with you. Remember and believe." Mira took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. She might not have asked for this responsibility, might not feel prepared for the challenges ahead. But she was a Blackwood. The blood of guardians and protectors ran in her veins. Whatever was coming, whatever battles lay ahead, Mira knew she couldn't run from her destiny. The ancestors' tale had been shared, the torch passed. Now it was her turn to write the next chapter in her family's long and secret history. With newfound courage, Mira turned from the window. There was work to be done, knowledge to be gained, power to be awakened. The darkness was stirring, and she would be ready to face it. The whispers in the wind grew stronger, guiding her forward. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Mira felt not fear, but a fierce, burning resolve. She was a Blackwood, a guardian of the forest. And she would not fail. The forest had never felt so alive. Mira stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest. The wind whipped around her, carrying whispers that grew more insistent by the moment. Leaves rustled with unnatural intensity, and shadows seemed to writhe between the trees. She'd come out here driven by an urgency she couldn't explain, guided by the voices of her ancestors. Now, as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Mira understood why. Something was changing. The very air crackled with energy, making the hair on her arms stand on end. In the distance, a flock of birds took flight, their panicked cries echoing through the twilight. "What's happening?" Mira whispered, though she feared she already knew the answer. "It awakens," came the response, a chorus of familiar voices carried on the wind. "Your presence, your blood, it has stirred what long lay dormant." A low rumble shook the ground beneath her feet. Mira stumbled, catching herself against a nearby tree. Its bark felt warm beneath her palm, almost feverish. "What do I do?" she called out, fear and persistence warring within her. But before any answer could come, a piercing shriek split the air. Mira clapped her hands over her ears, doubling over in pain. When she looked up again, her blood ran cold. At the far end of the clearing, the shadows were moving, coalescing into a shape that defied description, all writhing tentacles and gaping maws, eyes blinking open and closed across its roiling surface. "The Ancient One," the whispers hissed. "It tests the bindings." As if in response to the voices, tendrils of darkness shot out from the mass, probing the air. Where they touched, reality seemed to warp and bend. Grass withered, flowers turned to ash, and the very air shimmered with wrongness. Mira wanted to run, every instinct screaming at her to flee. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, her ancestors' blood singing in her veins. "No," she growled, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "You don't belong here." She raised her hands, not knowing what she intended to do, but driven by an instinct older than thought. To her amazement, light began to gather around her fingertips, soft at first, then growing brighter, pulsing in time with her racing heart. The entity recoiled, letting out another bone-chilling shriek. Its form roiled and churned, more eyes blinking open to fix upon Mira with ancient malevolence. The bindings, her ancestors' voices urged. "Reinforce the bindings." Mira had no idea how to do that. but her body seemed to move of its own accord. Her lips formed words in a language she'd never spoken, her hands tracing symbols in the air. With each gesture, lines of light appeared, hanging in the space between her and the encroaching darkness. The entity lashed out, its tendrils slamming against the glowing barrier. Mira gasped, feeling each impact like a physical blow. Sweat beaded on her brow as she fought to maintain the shield, drawing on reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. But it wasn't enough. With a sound like tearing reality, a tendril of darkness punched through her defenses. It snaked towards her with terrifying speed, and Mira knew with dreadful certainty that if it touched her, she would be lost. In that moment of desperation, a memory surfaced, her grandmother's voice, teaching a much younger Mira a rhyme she'd long forgotten. Blood of my blood, hear my plea. Stand with me now, set power free. By root and branch, by leaf and bough, I claim my birthright here and now. The words spilled from Mira's lips, and the forest erupted into brilliance. Light poured from every tree, every blade of grass. It flowed into Mira, filling her until she thought she might burst. When she raised her hands again, it was like directing the power of the sun itself. The darkness screamed, recoiling from the onslaught. Its form began to unravel, tatters of shadow dissipating into the night. But at its core, a cluster of baleful eyes remained, fixing Mira with a gaze of pure hatred. This isn't over, a voice like the death of stars grated in her mind. You've won nothing, little guardian. I am eternal. I am patient. And I will have this world. With a final, reality-shaking howl, the entity collapsed in on itself, vanishing into the shadows between one heartbeat and the next. The unnatural silence that followed was deafening. Mira fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The power that had filled her moments ago drained away, leaving her trembling and weak. But as her racing heart began to slow, a new sensation took hold, a connection to the forest around her, deeper and more profound than anything she'd ever experienced. She could feel the trees breathing, the slow pulse of sap through ancient roots. Creatures stirred in burrows and nests, slowly emerging from hiding. And beneath it all, she sensed the bindings, a complex web of energy anchoring the entity away from this world. Well done, child, her grandmother's voice whispered, pride evident in her tone. You've taken the first step. The first step. Mira croaked, struggling to her feet. What was that thing? Will it come back? That was but a fragment of the Ancient One's power, came the response, a chorus of ancestral voices. It probed for weakness, and found unexpected strength. But make no mistake, this was only the beginning. Mira shuddered, remembering the hatred in those alien eyes. How can I possibly fight something like that? The same way we always have, the whispers replied. With courage, with wisdom, and with the power passed down through our bloodline. You are not alone in this fight, Mira. We stand with you, as does the forest itself. As if in response to those words, a warm breeze rustled through the trees. Mira felt it wrap around her like an embrace, lending her strength. She looked down at her hands, marveling at the lingering glow beneath her skin. The power was real. The threat was real. There was no more room for doubt or denial. I understand now, Mira said softly, her voice growing stronger with each word. I accept my role. I am a Blackwood, a guardian of this forest. And I will do whatever it takes to protect it. The whispers of her ancestors swelled into a chorus of approval, filling the night air with an almost tangible sense of support and love. Mira squared her shoulders, lifting her chin with newfound stamina. The entity would return, of that, she had no doubt. But when it did, Mira would be ready. She had a legacy to uphold, a duty to fulfill, and a power awakening within her that she was only beginning to understand. As she made her way back to the cabin, Mira could feel the forest's attention on her, watchful, expectant. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges she could scarcely imagine. But for the first time since arriving, she felt truly at home. The whispers followed her, urgent but encouraging. Learn. Prepare. The darkness gathers its strength. But so too must you, last daughter of the Blackwood line. The true battle is yet to come. Mira nodded, her steps firm and purposeful. The awakening had begun, not just of the ancient evil, but of her own power and destiny. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it head-on. For she was Mira Blackwood, guardian of the forest. And the wind itself whispered her name. The attic of the old cabin had become Mira's sanctuary and training ground. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight as she pored over her grandmother's journals, spread out across a weathered oak table. Candles flickered in brass holders, their flames steady despite the lack of breeze. The circle is the foundation, her grandmother's voice whispered, a ghostly echo guiding Mira's hand as she sketched symbols in chalk on the wooden floor. It represents the cycle of life, the boundary between worlds. Master this, and all else will follow. Mira's brow furrowed in concentration as she completed the intricate design. It had taken her days to get it right, each failed attempt leaving her frustrated and doubt-ridden. But now, as she drew the final line, she felt a subtle shift in the air. The chalk lines began to glow with a soft, silvery light. Mira gasped, a mixture of awe and trepidation flooding through her. It was working. She was actually doing magic. Well done, came the approving whisper. Now, step into the circle and feel its power. Taking a deep breath, Mira crossed the glowing boundary. Immediately, she felt as if she'd stepped into another world. The air inside the circle was charged with energy, making her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. She could sense the ley lines running beneath the earth, the pulse of life in every tree surrounding the cabin. I did it, she breathed, a smile breaking across her face. I really did it. But her elation was short-lived. As she turned to consult the next page of her grandmother's journal, her foot smudged the chalk line. The glow flickered and died, the magical energy dissipating like mist in sunlight. Mira's shoulders slumped. Damn it, she muttered, frustration welling up inside her. She'd been at this for weeks now, making incremental progress, but always feeling like she was one step behind where she needed to be. The entity hadn't made another appearance since that night in the forest, but Mira could feel its presence growing stronger. The shadows seemed deeper, the nights longer. Time was running out, and she still felt woefully unprepared. Patience, child, her grandmother's voice soothed. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is a guardian's power. Trust in yourself. Trust in the bloodline. Mira wanted to believe those words, but doubt gnawed at her. She thought of the terrifying power the entity had displayed, of the generations of Blackwood women who had stood against it. How could she possibly live up to that legacy? With a sigh, she turned back to the journals. The next pages detailed a series of protective wards, symbols, and incantations meant to strengthen the bindings that held the Ancient One at bay. Mira gathered the materials listed, bundles of herbs, crystals, and a vial of what the journal claimed was starlight distilled. She raised an eyebrow at that, but after everything she'd seen, who was she to question it? Following the instructions, she began to craft the wards. Her fingers moved with increasing surety, weaving intricate knots and tracing symbols in the air. As she worked, she felt that same energy building, responding to her will and intent. But halfway through the third ward, doubt crept in again. Was she doing this right? What if she made a mistake? The consequences of failure loomed large in her mind, images of shadows consuming the world flashing before her eyes. Her hand trembled, and the crystal she was holding slipped from her grasp. It shattered on the floor, its fragments scattering across the chalk circle. No, 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 Mira groaned, dropping to her knees to gather the pieces. Tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. I can't do this. I'm not strong enough, not skilled enough. I'm going to fail, and everyone will suffer because of me. The whispers of her ancestors, usually a constant presence, fell silent. For a moment, Mira felt utterly alone, the weight of her responsibility crushing down upon her. Then, a warm hand touched her shoulder. Mira looked up, blinking through her tears, to see a shimmering apparition of her grandmother standing before her. "Oh, my dear girl," Rose said, her voice filled with compassion. "Do you think any of us felt ready when our time came? Do you think we didn't doubt ourselves, fear for the future? But you were all so strong," Mira protested. "The journals, the stories, you all seem like these incredible, fearless women. And I'm just me." Rose's ghostly form knelt beside her, and though Mira couldn't physically feel her, she sensed a warmth and love radiating from the apparition. "We were all just me once," Rose said gently. "What you see in those journals, what you hear in the whispers, those are the end results of years of struggle, of learning, of overcoming our fears and doubts. You're at the beginning of your journey, Mira. Give yourself the grace to grow." Mira wiped at her eyes, her grandmother's words sinking in. "But what if I make a mistake? What if I'm not good enough, and the entity breaks free? Then you'll face it," Rose said firmly. "With all the strength and courage I know you possess. You are a Blackwood, Mira. More than that, you are your own woman. The power within you is just waiting to be unleashed. Trust in it. Trust in yourself." As Rose spoke, the other whispers returned, a chorus of support and encouragement filling the attic. Mira felt their love, their faith in her, wrapping around her like a protective blanket. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "You're right," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I can do this. I will do this." Rose smiled, her form already beginning to fade. "That's my girl. Remember, we are always with you. In your blood, in your bones, in every breath of wind through the trees. You are never alone." As the apparition disappeared, Mira stood, surveying the scattered materials and smudged chalk lines. Instead of despair, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She might not be perfect, might not have all the answers, but she was a Blackwood. She was the guardian of this forest, the latest in a long line of powerful women who had faced the darkness and held it at bay. With steady hands, Mira began to redraw the circle. This time, as she worked, she embraced the doubts and fears, acknowledging them but not letting them rule her. She poured her energy, her love for her family and this land, into every line and symbol. The wards took shape, glowing with an inner light that seemed to pulse in time with Mira's heartbeat. As she completed the final incantation, she felt a surge of power unlike anything she'd experienced before. It flowed through her, out into the wards, and beyond, strengthening the very fabric of reality against the encroaching darkness. Exhausted but exhilarated, Mira sank to the floor within the glowing circle. She had done it. It wasn't perfect, and she knew she had much more to learn, but it was a start. A real, tangible step towards becoming the guardian she was meant to be. As the sun began to set outside, painting the attic in warm hues, Mira allowed herself a small smile. The path ahead was still daunting, the challenges enormous. But for the first time, she felt truly ready to face them. She was Mira Blackwood, guardian of the forest. And she was just getting started. The night air crackled with an unnatural energy, setting Mira's teeth on edge. She stood on the cabin's porch, her grandmother's amulet clutched tightly in one hand, the other tracing protective sigils in the air. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones, in the frantic whispers of her ancestors carried on the wind. "Be ready," they urged. "It tests you now." As if summoned by the thought, a bone-chilling howl split the night. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to warp and twist, their branches elongating into grasping tendrils. Shadows pooled between them, coalescing into a writhing mass of darkness. Mira's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. "I am Mira Blackwood," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Guardian of this forest. You are not welcome here." A sound like grinding stone emanated from the shadow, resolving into words that bypassed her ears and echoed directly in her mind. "Welcome. I was here before your kind learned to crawl from the mud. This land is mine, little guardian. And soon, you will be too." The entity defied easy description, its form a constantly shifting mass of shadows and void. At its core, it appeared as an immense, roiling darkness deeper than the blackest night. This darkness seemed to absorb light, creating an area of unnatural gloom around it. Within this shadowy mass, countless eyes of varying sizes appeared and disappeared. These eyes glowed with an eerie, sickly light, sometimes a putrid green, other times a bloody red, occasionally a cold, piercing blue. They blinked in unsettling patterns, never all at once, giving the impression of a constantly watchful presence. Tentacle-like appendages of pure shadow extended from the main mass, ranging from whip-thin tendrils to massive, tree-trunk-sized limbs. These appendages could stretch to impossible lengths and move with unnatural speed. They seemed capable of passing through solid matter, leaving a trail of withered plants or frosted surfaces in their wake. The entity's form was not constant. It could expand to fill an entire clearing or compress itself to squeeze through the narrowest of gaps. In moments of aggression, it might sprout jaw-like structures filled with needle-sharp teeth, or form claw-like protrusions capable of rending reality itself. When it spoke, no mouth was visible. Instead, the words seemed to emanate from the very air around it, a deep, resonating sound that bypassed the ears and echoed directly in the mind of those who heard it. The entity was ancient, patient, and utterly malevolent. Its primary drive was consumption, not just of matter and energy, but of emotions, memories, and the very essence of life itself. It fed on fear and suffering, growing stronger with each life it corrupted or destroyed. Intelligence-wise, the entity was cunning and strategic. It was capable of complex planning, often setting traps or manipulating events from afar before making a direct move. It had a deep understanding of human nature and didn't hesitate to exploit weaknesses, doubts, or desires. The entity possessed a vast reservoir of knowledge accumulated over eons. This made it a dangerous foe in verbal confrontations, as it could tailor its words to maximum psychological effect, weaving truths and lies into a disorienting tapestry. In direct conflict, the entity was ruthless and overwhelming. It attacked from multiple angles simultaneously, using its ability to manipulate shadow and reality to disorient and terrify its opponents. It wasn't above using illusions, or taking the form of loved ones to psychologically torture its victims. Despite its power, the entity had a sense of self-preservation. When faced with a truly formidable opponent or power, it was capable of retreating, biding its time until a more favorable opportunity presented itself. The entity harbored a particular hatred for the Blackwood line and other forces that had managed to constrain it over the centuries. This hatred manifested as a special kind of cruelty reserved for those it saw as its jailers. Perhaps most unsettling was the entity's capacity for patience. It thought in terms of centuries, not moments. Setbacks that would seem devastating to a mortal were mere inconveniences in its grand scheme. It was willing to wait generations for the right moment to strike, its malevolent presence a constant, lurking threat. When it spoke, the entity's voice was a symphony of terror, deep, resonant, and multilayered. Underlying tones might include the screams of past victims, the cracking of reality, or the hollow wind of the void. Its words carried power, each syllable heavy with malevolent intent and the weight of eons. The entity was not mindless in its destruction. It took a perverse pleasure in corruption, in turning the pure to the profane. It offered bargains and deals, promises of power or knowledge, always with a hidden cost that inevitably led to ruin. In essence, the entity was the embodiment of cosmic horror, vast, unknowable, and utterly inimical to human life and sanity. Its very presence warped reality, and prolonged exposure to its influence could shatter the strongest of minds. The mass surged forward, tentacles of pure darkness lashing out towards Mira. She raised her hands, calling upon the wards she'd spent weeks preparing. A shimmering barrier sprang to life, intercepting the entity's attack. For a moment, Mira allowed herself to hope. The barrier held, the entity's tendrils recoiling from its light. But then she heard a sound that chilled her to her core, the creaking, snapping noise of the wards beginning to fail. "Your pitiful magics cannot hold me," the entity's voice grated in her mind. "I am eternal. I am hunger incarnate. And I will feed." With a sound like reality tearing, the barrier shattered. Mira stumbled backwards, narrowly avoiding a tendril that gouged deep furrows in the porch, where she'd been standing. She scrambled for the door, slamming it shut behind her and hastily scrawling protective runes across its surface. The cabin shuddered as the entity hurled itself against the walls. Mira raced to the attic, her safe haven, where her strongest wards were laid. As she reached the top of the stairs, a tendril of darkness burst through a window, wrapping around her ankle. Mira cried out in pain and terror, as an icy coldness seeped into her body. Images flashed through her mind, the entity's memories, its hunger, the countless worlds it had consumed. She saw herself joining the writhing mass, her essence absorbed and her power turned against everything she loved. "No!" Mira shouted, drawing upon reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Light blazed from her hands, searing the tendril. It retreated with a howl of rage, leaving Mira gasping on the attic floor. She dragged herself to the center of the room, where her most powerful ward lay hidden beneath a rug. As she pulled it away, revealing the intricate chalk designs, the entity's voice filled her mind once more. "Foolish child. If I cannot have you, I will take everything else." The pressure against the cabin suddenly ceased. Mira felt the entity's presence receding, moving with terrifying speed towards. "Oh God," she whispered. "The town." Ignoring the pain in her ankle, Mira scrambled to her feet and raced down the stairs. She burst out of the cabin just in time to see a roiling mass of shadow disappearing into the forest, heading towards Pinewood Grove. Mira ran to her truck, gunning the engine and peeling down the dirt road. Her mind raced faster than the vehicle, trying to remember any ritual that might help against a full-scale attack. But she knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that she was out of her depth. As she crested the hill overlooking Pinewood Grove, her heart nearly stopped. Tendrils of darkness wrapped around buildings, smashing windows and tearing through walls. Screams filled the air as townspeople fled in panic. Mira skidded to a stop in the town square, leaping out of the truck. She saw Hank from the general store trying to herd a group of children to safety. A massive shadow reared up behind him. "Hank, look out!" Mira shouted, raising her hands and channeling every ounce of power she could muster. A beam of light shot from her palms, striking the shadow and causing it to recoil with a shriek. Hank turned, his eyes widening at the sight of Mira. "I knew it," he muttered. "You're just like your grandmother." There was no time for explanations. "Get everyone to the church," Mira ordered, remembering her grandmother's journals mentioning it as a place of power. "I'll hold it off as long as I can." As Hank hurried the children away, Mira faced the writhing darkness that was consuming the town. She began to chant, her voice growing stronger with each word, weaving a web of light that pushed back against the encroaching shadows. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The entity's advance slowed, its tendrils withdrawing from some of the buildings. But then Mira heard a scream that made her blood run cold. Grace, the woman who had been so hostile in the store, was trapped in the upper window of her home, a tendril of darkness wrapped around her waist. As Mira watched in horror, the shadow yanked Grace from the window. There was a sickening crunch, and the woman's cries were abruptly silenced. "No!" Mira cried out, her concentration faltering. The web of light flickered, and the entity pressed its advantage. More screams filled the air. Mira saw bodies lying motionless in the streets, lives snuffed out in the entity's relentless assault. She had failed them. She wasn't strong enough, wasn't prepared enough. Yes, the entity's voice boomed in her mind, reveling in her despair. Feel your failure, little guardian. Feel the weight of their deaths on your soul. Give in to despair and join me. Tears streamed down Mira's face as she continued to fight, pouring every ounce of her strength into holding the darkness at bay. But she was weakening, her power flagging. Just as she felt her knees begin to buckle, a warm hand gripped her shoulder. "Not alone," Hank's gruff voice said behind her. "You ain't alone in this, girl." Mira felt other hands join his, townspeople gathering around her. Their touch lent her strength, their belief in her fanning the flames of her power. With a cry that held generations of defiance, Mira unleashed a final, desperate blast of energy. Light exploded outward, driving the shadows back to the forest. The entity's scream of rage shook the very ground, and then silence. Mira collapsed, caught by the supportive arms of the townspeople. As her vision blurred, she saw the extent of the damaged buildings in ruins, bodies lying in the streets. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. "I'm sorry," she whispered, darkness closing in around her. "I'm so sorry." The last thing she heard before consciousness fled was Hank's voice, gentle but firm. "You did what you could, girl. But now the real work begins." As Mira slipped into unconsciousness, the weight of her failure pressed down upon her. The entity had been driven back, but not defeated. And Pinewood Grove would never be the same again. The town hall of Pinewood Grove had seen better days. Hastily repaired windows were boarded up, and the smell of fresh paint mingled with the lingering scent of smoke. But it was standing, which was more than could be said for many buildings in town. Mira stood at the podium, her hands gripping its edges so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The faces staring back at her were a mix of emotions: fear, anger, confusion, and from a select few, understanding. "I know you all have questions," Mira began, her voice shaky, but gaining strength. "About what happened, about what I am. You deserve answers, and I'm here to provide them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hank, sitting in the front row, gave her an encouraging nod. "My family, the Blackwoods, have been guardians of this forest for generations. We've protected this land, and by extension, this town, from a darkness most of you couldn't imagine. Until now." The murmur grew louder. Someone in the back shouted, "Protected. Tell that to Grace. To all the others we lost." Mira flinched as if struck, but pressed on. "I'm so sorry for your losses. I wasn't prepared. I failed you. But I'm asking for your help now, to make sure it never happens again. Why should we trust you?" A man Mira recognized as the town's mayor stood up. "Your protection has brought nothing but destruction. Maybe if you leave, this thing will leave us alone." "It won't," a new voice spoke up. All heads turned to see an elderly woman making her way to the front. Mira recognized her as Mrs. Abernathy, the town librarian. "The darkness was here long before us, long before the Blackwoods. It sleeps, it wakes, it hungers. Without a guardian, would have been consumed long ago. Mira stared at the old woman in shock. You know about my family, about the entity. Mrs. Abernathy nodded, a sad smile on her weathered face. Some of us have always known, child. We've kept the secret, helped where we could. Your grandmother was a dear friend. This is insane, the mayor sputtered. Clara, you can't honestly believe this nonsense about dark entities and magical guardians. I've seen things, Edwin, Mrs. Abernathy replied sharply. Things that would turn your hair white. The Blackwoods have carried this burden alone for too long. It's time we stepped up. A chorus of agreement rose from various points in the room. Mira was stunned to see several people nodding, intensity replacing fear in their eyes. But not everyone was convinced. A group led by the mayor began shouting, demanding Mira leave town immediately. The meeting devolved into chaos, with people arguing heatedly on both sides. Enough! Hank's voice boomed over the din. The room fell silent. Fighting amongst ourselves is exactly what that thing wants. Now, I ain't much for hocus pocus, but I saw what I saw. And I saw this girl put herself between us and a nightmare. She needs our help, and by God, I'm going to give it. He turned to Mira. What do you need from us? Mira took a deep breath, overwhelmed by the show of support. Knowledge, for starters. Mrs. Abernathy, you said some of you have always known. I need to know everything you do about the entity, about my family's history here. The librarian nodded. Come by the library. There are records, old journals, things your grandmother entrusted to me for safekeeping. I need safe spaces, too, Mira continued, gaining confidence. Places we can fortify, where people can gather if there's another attack. The church seems to have some natural protection, but we'll need more. The community center, someone suggested. And the old barn on the edge of town. They are both solid structures, easy to defend. Mira nodded gratefully. And I need people willing to learn. The rituals, the wards, they're stronger when more people participate. I can teach you, train you to help reinforce the protections around the town. To her surprise, several hands shot up, volunteering. But not everyone was on board. This is madness, the mayor declared. I won't have our town turned into some occult battleground. Miss Blackwood, I'm officially asking you to leave Pinewood Grove. For everyone's safety. A tense silence fell over the room. Mira felt her heart sink, but before she could respond, an unexpected ally spoke up. You do that, Edwin, and you'll have a recall election on your hands faster than you can blink, Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice steely. Half this town owes their lives to this girl. We're not turning our backs on her now. The mayor sputtered, but it was clear he was losing ground. More and more people were nodding, moving to stand near Mira in a show of support. Fine, he spat eventually. But when this blows up in our faces, and it will, don't come crying to me. He stormed out, a small group of supporters trailing behind him. As the door slammed shut, Mira let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked out at the faces of those who remained her allies, her support system, her friends. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I know I'm asking a lot. And I know you're scared. I am too. But together, we might just have a chance. The meeting broke up into smaller groups, people discussing plans and volunteering for various tasks. Mira found herself surrounded by those eager to learn, to help, to be part of something greater than themselves. As the evening wore on, Mira felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with magic. For the first time since arriving in Pinewood Grove, she felt like she belonged. But the warmth was tempered by a chill of foreboding. The entity's last attack had been brutal, but Mira knew in her bones it had only been testing the waters. The real battle was yet to come. As if sensing her thoughts, Mrs. Abernathy appeared at her elbow. "Don't fret, child," she said softly. "You're not alone in this fight anymore." Mira managed a small smile. "No, I'm not. But I've made enemies too. The mayor, his supporters, they'll make things difficult." Bah, Mrs. Abernathy waved a dismissive hand. "Edwin's always been a fool. But keep an eye on him all the same. Fear makes people do stupid things." Mira nodded, making a mental note to set wards around her cabin. Just in case. As the meeting wound down, Mira found herself on the town hall steps, looking out at the partially rebuilt Pinewood Grove. The scars of the entity's attack were still visible, but so too were signs of resilience, buildings under repair, people helping their neighbors, a community coming together in the face of the unthinkable. She felt the weight of their trust, their hope, settling on her shoulders. It was a heavy burden, but no longer one she had to bear alone. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the voices of her ancestors. But now, mingled with their guidance, Mira heard something new: the fury of the townspeople, the strength of her newfound allies. "We're ready," she whispered to the night. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As if in response, the shadows at the edge of the forest seemed to deepen, a reminder that the entity was always watching, always waiting. But for the first time since this all began, Mira felt a flicker of true hope. The battle lines were drawn. Allies and enemies had been made. And Mira Blackwood, no longer alone in her role as guardian, stood ready to fight for her home, her legacy, and the people who had chosen to stand with her against the encroaching dark. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment, the sky over Pinewood Grove was clear, stars twinkling in the velvet darkness. The next, roiling clouds blotted out the heavens, and a wind like the breath of some ancient beast howled through the trees. Mira stood on the porch of her cabin, every nerve on high alert. This was no natural tempest. She could feel the malevolence behind it, the hungering void that sought to devour everything in its path. The entity was making its move. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed with incoming messages. Hank, Mrs. Abernathy, and the others they'd trained in basic warding all reporting the same thing. Shadows moving against the wind. Whispers in the dark. The wards at the edge of town flickering like candles in a gale. "It's time," Mira murmured, as much to herself as to the spirits of her ancestors that she could feel gathering around her. She raised her voice, calling out to those she knew were on their way. "To the cabin. We make our stand there." Headlights cut through the gloom as vehicles navigated the twisting forest road. Mira's allies poured out, Hank with his shotgun, loaded with shells Mira had blessed, Mrs. Abernathy clutching an ancient tome, others carrying bags of salt, iron filings, and herbs for reinforcing the wards. They worked quickly, efficiently, following the plans they'd drilled over the past weeks. A perimeter was established, wards laid down and empowered. Mira moved among them, lending her strength, her birthright, to each protective barrier. But even as they labored, the entity's presence grew stronger. The wind shrieked, carrying with it the cries of forgotten things. Trees groaned and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like tortured souls seeking release. And then, with a sound like reality tearing, the attack began in earnest. Shadows coalesced at the edge of the warded perimeter, taking on monstrous shapes, all teeth and claws and hungering voids. They hurled themselves against the barriers, each impact sending shockwaves of cold malevolence through the defenders. Mira gritted her teeth, drawing deep on her power to reinforce the weakening wards. Around her, her allies chanted the protective phrases she'd taught them, their voices rising in defiance against the howling wind. For a time, it seemed to be working. The entity's assaults were turned back, its shadowy minions dissipating against the light of the wards. But with each wave, the attacks grew stronger, more focused. A particularly vicious assault shattered one of the outer wards. Hank's shotgun boomed, the blessed shells tearing through a writhing mass of shadow. But for each one banished, two more surged forward. Mira. Mrs. Abernathy's voice cut through the chaos. The cabin. It's trying to breach the heart ward. Mira spun, horror clutching at her heart. The entity had been clever, using its frontal assault as a distraction. Now, tendrils of pure darkness were seeping through cracks in the cabin's foundation, seeking the nexus of power at its core. Without thinking, Mira sprinted for the cabin. She could hear her allies calling out in alarm, but their voices faded as she crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was thick with shadow, every surface writhing with malevolent energy. Mira fought her way up the stairs, each step a battle against the encroaching dark. She could feel it pulling at her, whispers of power and temptation slithering through her mind. Join us, the voices hissed. Your ancestors did. Their power flows through you. Embrace it. Become one with the eternal dark. Never, Mira growled, but doubt gnawed at her. Had her ancestors truly fallen? Was she fighting a losing battle against a fate long ordained? She reached the attic, where the heart ward pulsed weakly. Tendrils of shadow had nearly engulfed it, and as Mira watched in horror, cracks began to spread across its surface. With a cry of desperation, Mira threw herself at the ward, pouring every ounce of her power into it. Light blazed from her hands, pushing back the darkness. But it wasn't enough. She could feel her strength ebbing, the relentless assault of the entity overwhelming her defenses. I can't, she gasped, falling to her knees. I'm not strong enough. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. As her vision began to dim, as the shadows closed in around her, Mira felt a warmth blossom in her chest. It spread through her body, and with it came voices, not the seductive whispers of the entity, but the strong, clear tones of her ancestors. She saw them then, generations of Blackwood women stretching back through time. They stood with her, around her, within her. Their power flowed into Mira, not as a trickle, but as a mighty river. You are never alone, they spoke as one. Our strength is your strength. Our will is your will. Rise, Mira Blackwood. Rise and show this ancient evil the true power of our line. Mira surged to her feet, her body blazing with light. She thrust her hands towards the heart ward, and pure, radiant energy poured forth. The shadows shrieked and recoiled, burning away like mist before the rising sun. The light expanded, filling the cabin, pulsing outward to reinforce every ward and barrier. Mira felt her consciousness expand with it, connecting with her allies outside. She lent them her strength, fueled by the power of her ancestors, and felt their awe and ferocity in return. United, they pushed back against the darkness. The entity's assault faltered, then broke. With a howl of rage that shook the very foundations of the earth, it retreated, fleeing back to the depths of the forest. As the unnatural storm dissipated, Mira stumbled out onto the porch. Her allies gathered around her, their faces a mix of exhaustion and elation. They had done it. They had weathered the dark night. But Mira's expression remained grave. Yes, they had won this battle, and the cost had not been as steep as she had feared. Yet she could still feel the entity's presence, wounded but far from defeated. Its final shriek echoed in her mind, not just rage, but a promise. This is not over, Guardian. I am eternal, and eternally patient. Your line will falter. Your allies will fade. And when they do, I will be waiting. Mira looked out at the faces of those who had stood with her, who had risked everything to protect their home. She saw their trust, their hope, their budding understanding of the power they all held. No, she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. No, it's not over. But neither are we. Whatever comes next, we face it together. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Mira stood tall, surrounded by her allies, bolstered by the spirits of her ancestors. The dark night had passed, but greater challenges lay ahead. And Mira Blackwood, guardian of Pinewood Grove, would be ready. The old library basement was thick with dust and the musty scent of ancient tomes. Mira hunched over a weathered oak table, surrounded by stacks of grimoires and scrolls. Her eyes burned from hours of reading by candlelight, but she couldn't stop. Not when she was so close. There has to be something, she muttered, pushing aside yet another useless volume. Some way to end this for good. Mrs. Abernathy's voice drifted down from the top of the stairs. Mira, dear, you need to rest. You've been at this for days. Mira sighed, rubbing her temples. I can't, Mrs. A. The entity is getting stronger. I can feel it. We're running out of time. The old librarian made her way carefully down the stairs, a steaming mug in her hands. At least have some tea. Your grandmother swore by this blend for clear thinking. As Mira accepted the mug gratefully, her elbow knocked against a small, leather-bound book. It fell to the floor, pages splaying open. Something about the script caught her eye. Wait, she breathed, setting down the tea and snatching up the book. This is... I've never seen this before. Mrs. Abernathy peered over her shoulder. Ah, that old thing. It was mixed in with some donations. I always meant to catalogue it properly, but... Mira wasn't listening. Her eyes raced across the pages, heart pounding. This is it, she whispered. The answer we've been looking for. The book detailed an ancient ritual, older than the Blackwood line itself. A way to bind the entity not just for a generation, but for eternity. As Mira read further, however, her excitement turned to dread. No, she said softly. There has to be another way. Mrs. Abernathy gently took the book from Mira's trembling hands. As she read, her face paled. Oh, my dear girl. This cost is too high, Mira finished, standing abruptly. We'll find another way. We have to. But even as she said it, Mira knew the truth. This was their only chance. The ritual would require the ultimate sacrifice, the willing surrender of a guardian's life force, their very essence, to create a permanent barrier between worlds. Mira fled the basement, needing air, needing space to think. She found herself walking the streets of Pinewood Grove, lost in thought. The town was a hive of activity. After the last attack, everyone was working to reinforce defenses, stockpile supplies, prepare for the worst. Mira saw grit in their faces, but also fear. They were counting on her to protect them. Her feet carried her to the edge of town, to the makeshift memorial for those lost in the entity's first assault. Flowers and mementos surrounded photographs of smiling faces, lives cut short, because she hadn't been prepared. I'm sorry, Mira whispered, touching one of the photos. It was Grace, the woman who had been so hostile to her at first. I failed you. I failed all of you. You didn't fail anyone, a gruff voice said behind her. Mira turned to see Hank approaching, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. You've given us a fighting chance. Mira smiled weakly. A chance might not be enough, Hank. The entity, it's gathering its strength. I can feel it. The next attack will make the others look like warm-ups. Hank's eyes narrowed. You found something in those old books, didn't you? Something big. Mira hesitated, then nodded. She explained the ritual, watching Hank's expression grow more grave with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, so that's it, huh? You sacrifice yourself, and this thing goes away forever. That's the idea, Mira said softly. Hank shook his head. There's gotta be another way. You're too young, too important to. To what, Hank? Mira interrupted, a sudden fire in her voice. To die? Tell that to Grace. Tell it to all of them. She gestured at the memorial. I'm the guardian. If my death can save everyone else, isn't that my duty? Hank looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just pulled Mira into a rough embrace. You're a good kid, Mira Blackwood. Your grandma would be proud. As Mira returned to the cabin that evening, her mind was made up. She would perform the ritual. She would end this threat once and for all, no matter the cost. But as she opened the door, a wave of whispers washed over her. The spirits of her ancestors, more agitated than she'd ever felt them. Danger, they hissed. Trap. Deception. Mira froze. What do you mean? She asked aloud. The ritual in the book. Lies, came the response. Ancient lies. The entity's work. Realization hit Mira like a physical blow. The book, appearing just when they were most desperate. The ritual that seemed too perfect, too convenient. She had nearly walked right into the entity's trap. As if summoned by her understanding, a cold wind began to howl around the cabin. Shadows deepened, and Mira could feel the malevolent presence pressing in from all sides. Foolish guardian, the entity's voice boomed in her mind. Did you think you could find a way to destroy me? I am eternal. I am inevitable. Mira stood her ground, drawing on her power to create a barrier around the cabin. You're right, she called out. I can't destroy you. But I can sure as hell keep fighting you. The entity's laughter shook the very foundations of the earth. Brave words, little one. But your strength wanes. Your allies falter. And now, with your hope of victory crushed, I will show you true despair. The assault that followed made all previous attacks seem like child's play. Mira fought with everything she had, calling on every scrap of knowledge, every ounce of her birthright. But she could feel her defenses crumbling, the entity's corrupt power seeping through every crack. As she fell to her knees, gasping for breath, Mira felt the warmth of her ancestors surrounding her. Their voices, once a whisper, now rang out clear and strong. You are not beaten, daughter of our line. The true ritual lies within you, passed down through generations. Trust in yourself. Trust in us. The power to bind the darkness has always been yours. Understanding bloomed in Mira's mind. Not a sacrifice of death, but of life. A willing dedication of her entire being to the role of guardian, merging her essence with the very land she protected. As the entity breached her final defenses, as darkness began to flood the cabin, Mira closed her eyes and opened herself fully to her heritage. She felt the power of every Blackwood before her flowing through her veins, felt her consciousness expanding to encompass the forest, the town, the very bedrock beneath her feet. Mira Blackwood smiled, her eyes snapping open with a light that rivaled the stars. You want to see true power, she said, her voice resonating with the strength of generations. Let me show you. The entity howled in rage and terror as Mira began to chant, the true ritual flowing from her lips as naturally as breathing. Light exploded outward, driving back the darkness. The final battle for Pinewood Grove had begun. The forest trembled with otherworldly energy as Mira Blackwood stood at its heart, her feet planted firmly on the earth of her ancestors. Around her, reality itself seemed to warp and twist, the boundary between worlds growing thin. The entity loomed before her, a writhing mass of shadows and malevolent intent. Its countless eyes fixed upon Mira with a hunger that transcended physical form. Foolish child, its voice boomed, shaking the very air. You cannot hope to stand against me. I am eternal. I am. You are not welcome here, Mira interrupted, her voice steady and strong. She felt the power of generations flowing through her veins, the whispers of her ancestors a chorus of support in her mind. The entity lashed out, tendrils of pure darkness whipping towards Mira. But they met a barrier of light that sprang up around her, fueled by her will and the strength of her bloodline. Mira began to chant, the words of the true ritual flowing from her lips. It wasn't a spell from some ancient tome, but a truth that had always lived within her, passed down through countless generations. As she spoke, the forest came alive around her. Trees groaned and shifted, their roots breaking through the earth to form intricate patterns. The wind carried the scent of long-forgotten herbs, and the very ground thrummed with power. The entity shrieked, realizing too late the trap it had stumbled into. It hurled itself against Mira's defenses, unleashing wave after wave of corrupting energy. Mira staggered under the assault, feeling the weight of the entity's ancient evil pressing down upon her. Doubts crept in, old fears whispering in the back of her mind. Was she really strong enough? Could she bear the burden that had broken so many before her? But then she heard them, not just the whispers of her ancestors, but the voices of those she had come to love in Pinewood Grove. Hank's gruff encouragement, Mrs. Abernathy's wise counsel, the townspeople's unwavering support. They believed in her, had stood with her against the darkness. Mira's resolve hardened. She was not alone. She would never be alone again. With a cry that held the defiance of generations, Mira thrust her hands towards the entity. Light poured from her, not just the pale glow of her previous efforts, but a radiance that rivaled the sun itself. The entity howled in agony as the light touched it, its form beginning to unravel. But still it fought, concentrating all its malevolence into one final, desperate assault. "If I fall, I will take you with me," it roared, launching itself directly at Mira. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Mira saw the choice before her with perfect clarity. She could dodge, could try to save herself. But doing so would leave a gap in the ritual, a weakness the entity could exploit. Or she could stand her ground, could offer herself fully to the magic coursing through her. It would complete the binding, would save the forest and the town. But the cost? Mira closed her eyes, a single tear trailing down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered, thinking of the life she was leaving behind, the future she would never see. Then she opened her eyes, lifted her chin, and spoke the final words of the ritual. The entity slammed into her just as the last syllable left her lips. There was pain, unimaginable pain, as Mira felt her very essence being torn apart and remade. She screamed, the sound echoing through the forest and beyond, carrying with it all her fear, her strength, her love for the land she had sworn to protect. And then, silence. Mira found herself floating in a void, formless, weightless. She could feel the entity there with her, trapped, its rage impotent against the bonds of the ritual. "What have you done?" it hissed, its voice no longer the earth-shaking roar, but a pitiful whisper. "What I was always meant to do," Mira replied, surprised to find she still had a voice. "I am the guardian, the protector of this land. And you will trouble it no more." She felt the entity rail against its prison, felt its fury and its fear. But the bonds held firm, fueled by Mira's sacrifice and the power of her bloodline. Slowly, Mira became aware of something else. The forest, she could feel every tree, every blade of grass, every creature that called it home. She was a part of it now, her consciousness spread throughout the land she had given everything to protect. And there, at the edges of her awareness, she felt them. Her ancestors, no longer just whispers in the wind, but a constant, comforting presence. They surrounded her with love and pride, welcoming her into their eternal vigil. "Well done, daughter," they said as one. "The burden is heavy, but you will never bear it alone." Mira felt a tug, a calling. She found herself back in her physical form, standing in the clearing where the battle had taken place. But everything was different now. Colors were more vivid, scents more complex. She could feel the pulse of life all around her, could hear the whispers of the wind as clearly as spoken words. She looked down at her hands, marveling at the soft glow that emanated from her skin. She was changed, fundamentally and irrevocably. No longer fully human, but something more than a true guardian, bound to the land in a way none of her ancestors had been before. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in brilliant hues, Mira made her way back to the cabin. It felt different now, not just a building, but an extension of herself, a focal point for her power and her connection to the forest. She could sense the townspeople stirring, awakening to a world forever changed. There would be explanations needed, adjustments to be made. But that was for later. For now, Mira stood on the porch of her cabin, her true home, and looked out at the forest that was now as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. The whispers of her ancestors surrounded her, no longer warnings, but a constant source of comfort and guidance. "I am Mira Blackwood," she said softly, feeling the rightness of the words in her very soul. "Guardian of the forest, protector of Pinewood Grove. And I am home." As the new day dawned, Mira felt a sense of peace settle over her. The threat was neutralized, the land was safe. Her journey had been difficult, the cost high, but she had found her true destiny. Yet even as Mira basked in the warmth of her victory, something stirred in the depths of the forest. Miles away, in a dark hollow untouched by the morning light, a low growl rumbled through the undergrowth. Ancient eyes blinked open, fixing upon some unseen threat. Muscles rippled beneath fur that had not seen sunlight in centuries. The entity was bound, the immediate danger past. But the forest held secrets older than even the Blackwood line. And as one threat faded, another awakened, drawn by the surge of power that had reshaped the land. The whispers of destiny continued, carried on a wind that hinted at challenges yet to come.
And so, dear viewers, we come to the end of our tale. Mira Blackwood has faced the darkness and emerged changed, forever bound to the land she's sworn to protect. But as one threat fades, another stirs in the depths of the forest. What new horrors await our guardian? What other secrets does the ancient woodland hold? Only time will tell, and sinister media will be here to whisper those secrets into your eager ears. If you enjoyed this journey into the supernatural, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Sinister Media. Ring that bell to ensure you never miss a tale from the shadows. And remember, the next time you hear a whisper on the wind, it might not just be your imagination. Until next time, sleep tight, and don't let the ancient evils bite.